At the time of making this video, almost every city in the United States has been experiencing a wave of protests. Many of them have ended in violence and looting. In the middle of the biggest health crisis of the century, Americans are now also dealing with the most violent revolts in decades. And what has sparked this? One name, George Floyd, an unarmed citizen who was killed by a Minneapolis policeman. It occurred on May 25th, 2020. And you're probably wondering, has this really broken out just for one man? Well, of course not. This murder is just the last straw. The United States has a serious problem with police brutality, and African American people are the group that suffers the most. And the question is, why? How is it possible that the world's greatest power has these problems? How is it possible that in a country that, in many ways, is considered a model for democracy, there is such a problem with racism? In this video, we're going to tell you. I'm going to ask you a question, and it's not something you'll find an answer to on Wikipedia. Which country in the world has the most people in jail? Exactly, you guessed it, the United States. The next ones on the list are Thailand and Turkmenistan. That's right, the United States has more people in jail than Turkmenistan with its wild dictatorship, or even North Korea. But we're not just talking about incarceration figures, we're also talking about police brutality. Just look at this.
Getting killed by police is a leading cause of death for young black men in America. LA Times.
To give you an idea, in 2019 alone, more than 1,098 people were killed by the police. And of those 1,098, 256 were black. And you'll probably say, then there are more whites killed than blacks. Well, yes, you're right. The problem is that whites make up more than 72% of the US population, and African Americans only 12%. If we take that data into account, we come to two conclusions. One, the United States has a problem with its police, and two, the police have a fixation with the African American population. And some will think, well, that's because in the US, they are hard on crime. Break the law, pay the price. And thanks to that, it must be the safest country on the planet, right? Well, not even close. Actually, this country has a serious crime problem, and I mean serious. The homicide rate per 100,000 inhabitants in the United States is higher than that of countries such as Kenya or the Sudan. In other words, all that police brutality and those high incarceration rates aren't effective in reducing crime. In other words, Americans have every reason to protest.
Protests rage across US cities over George Floyd's death. Minnesota deploys more National Guard troops as other local authorities impose curfews. The Financial Times.
Of course, it is one thing to argue that the reason for the protests is legitimate, and something very different to say that the violence is justified. Unfortunately, there are groups of radicals who are doing their best to turn the protests into a kind of coronavirus version of Mad Max. But you know all that, and you have seen plenty of footage in lots of media outlets. The question we're asking ourselves today is, why is the USA still so racist? Why do they have so many people in jail, and at the same time, so much crime on the streets? As always, we're going to answer these questions, but first, let's look at some history.
The big American problem.
I'm going to ask you a question. Where do you think it's easier to get shot? In Medellin, Colombia, or Baltimore, United States? Think about it. Medellin is infamous for being the birthplace of Pablo Escobar. Baltimore is the birthplace of Edgar Allan Poe. Well, looking at all the statistics, the correct answer is Baltimore. And you know what's the worst thing? Baltimore isn't even the most dangerous city in the US. And yes, let's be honest, America is becoming less and less violent. Since the 1970s, homicide rates have fallen consistently year after year. The problem, that even with that improvement, they are still at crazy levels. In fact, this is one of the first things that catches the eye of any European visiting the United States. To give you a comparison, in Spain, the homicide rate for every 100,000 inhabitants is 0.62. In the US, we're talking about 4.96. Basically, you can walk around almost any neighborhood of Madrid without fear. Good luck if you're thinking about doing the same thing in Detroit. And I know what you're all going to think. This is the great stereotype that all Europeans have when they look at the United States. The Second Amendment is to blame, the right to bear arms. In the United States, they love their rifles and their machine guns more than the Spanish love their Iberian ham and chorizo. And of course, if you buy a Winchester, you feel like using it, don't you? Well, maybe gun ownership has some influence, but the truth is that the United States is not the only country with guns. For example, in the Czech Republic, you can also have weapons. What's more, there are even guided tours for tourists, where they are allowed to shoot an AK-47. And all this is perfectly legal. However, the Czech Republic is one of the safest countries in the world. Only 0.6 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. And something similar happens when you look at Switzerland or Israel. In these two countries, you cannot only have weapons, they are mandatory. Yes, that's right. Both Israel and Switzerland have compulsory military service, and all citizens are obliged to have a gun, at least for a while. In fact, if you go to any mall in Tel Aviv, you could see a young woman doing the shopping with an assault rifle draped over her arm. It's not because she likes guns, it's because she's forced to do it while she's in the army. You can't be without your weapon at any time of the day. Despite this, Israel is as safe as France, for example. Of course, they have other problems, but criminality is not one of them. And you'll say, so why is the US so violent? Of course, there are many factors that could explain this violence. Top of the list is poverty. Yes, friends of VisualPolitik. The USA is the world's #1 economic power, but also one of the countries with the most inequality. In Hollywood, they have the most luxurious mansions in the world, but if you drive 30 minutes to the south, you will find Compton, with a totally different reality. And it is in these areas that appear in every city throughout the country that almost all poverty and crime are concentrated. And in the US, poverty is often connected to another very important feature, race. To give you an idea, the average income of an African American man in the United States is up to 60% lower than that of a white man. But that's not all. If you're African American, it means that you're much more likely to be attacked than if you are white, Hispanic, or Asian. Although, let's be honest, chances are that the person who attacks you is also African American. It doesn't matter what set of statistics we look at. In virtually every case, we find the same pattern. Asians do great, then the whites, then Hispanics, and finally African Americans. And I repeat, it doesn't matter what disadvantage the statistics are reporting, even this.
Disproportionately black counties account for over half of the coronavirus cases in the US, and nearly 60% of deaths, study finds. The Washington Post.
And you're probably thinking, but how is this even possible? It's been almost 60 years since Martin Luther King delivered his famous speech. The US has even had a black president. How is it possible that this country remains so racist? Let's look at that right now.
Country within a country.
As a European, the first thing that strikes me about the US is the obsession with race. I mean, I've filled out lots of forms in my life, ID cards, social security cards, etc. I've never been asked about my ethnic group. However, in the United States, the ethnic group question is present in almost every form. In some states, it even appears on your ID card. So why is race so important in this country? In part, the answer comes from its own history. Undoubtedly, one of the most pitiful pages in American history is slavery. For decades, southern states had African slaves working on tobacco and cotton plantations. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln introduced an amendment to the Constitution to abolish slavery, and this was one of the main reasons Civil War broke out. It was a war that lasted 4 years, and that gave the entire African population their freedom back. So far, everything sounds fantastic, doesn't it? Well, yes and no. Ending slavery doesn't mean ending racism. After the end of the Civil War, a terrorist group emerged, the Ku Klux Klan, whose goal was to persecute and kill all the freed slaves. But we're not just talking about a terrorist group. The southern states passed several laws that allowed the segregation of blacks. Oh yes, they could be free, but they couldn't mix with whites. Now, imagine that you're one of those just freed. You've just been released, and now you have to look for work. Your white counterparts have gone to school. They have a good education, and received an inheritance from their parents. They have businesses, savings, and many own houses. You start with nothing, and in a totally hostile environment. What would you do? Well, the same thing that more than 6 million African Americans did. Emigrate to the north of the United States. This phenomenon is called the Great Migration. I don't know if you noticed, but I mentioned 6 million people that we might as well call refugees. To give you a comparison, during the European refugee crisis in 2015, around 290,000 people arrived. And in this case, we're talking about 6 million. Of course, this Great Migration did not occur in a few years. We're actually talking about a process that started in roughly 1910 and lasted for 5 decades. But still, we're talking about one of the biggest migrations in history. And as you can imagine, the northern states didn't have as many jobs to offer. suddenly they had thousands of people who kept arriving year after year. Many of them entered Detroit's automotive industries. Many others ended up living in slums in poverty. And that explains why we can still see the news like this today.
Majority black counties see triple the COVID death rate, Bloomberg.
Forget the COVID for a moment and focus on this concept. Black counties. Even today, in black states, there are still neighborhoods or even entire counties where the entire African American population is concentrated. And as you can imagine, these zones are not necessarily middle class. And if there's one thing that is proven time and time again in almost every study, when poverty is concentrated in a very low income area, it's only a matter of time before crime rates start to rise. So now you're probably wondering what the US has done to solve this problem. Well, check this out.
Law and order.
Law and order. That was the slogan with which Nixon won the 1968 election. Under this slogan, a very clear policy was put forward. The only way to end crime is to be unbending. And here, we have to reflect for a moment. Both the United States and the United Kingdom have a completely different legal system than most European countries have. Its laws are based on so-called common law. To give you an idea, in a country like Spain, for example, there is a thing called the penal code. All the alleged crimes and their corresponding penalties are written here. Judges simply apply that criminal code. In the United States, almost all court decisions are made based on previous cases. That's why you've seen so many trial movies where the lawyer says, in the case of the state of Minnesota versus John Johnson did such and such a thing. Well, one of the cases that dictates doctrine occurred in 1982, in the so-called Harlow versus Fitzgerald case. This trial saw the passing of a new legal doctrine. Take a look.
Qualified immunity is a legal doctrine in the United States federal law that shields government officials from being sued for discretionary actions performed within their official capacity.
Yes, this is the principle that explains so much police violence. For example, the policeman who killed George Floyd had already been accused of police brutality in other cases, but with no solid evidence and being an officer in the line of duty, no court could do anything against him. And this is the principle that has been protecting thousands of policemen ever since the 1980s. But that's not the whole story. Imagine you're a cop in Detroit. Your job is to deter crime. But obviously you can't just walk into a slum and detain everybody. First, because you need a court order. I mean, you need to filter out the people who are most likely to commit a crime. But as you can imagine, criminals don't walk around with a sign on their forehead that says criminal. This is where racism plays a key role, because statistics don't lie. African Americans are the race most at risk of social exclusion. That means they're more likely to be victims or aggressors. Of course, this is not the only variable, but it's the easiest to spot with the naked eye. Well, all this explains another reality as sad as it is true.
Los Angeles police accused of racial profiling.
And that's not the end of the story. Another very peculiar thing about the United States legal system are the attorney generals and sheriffs. In many cases, they are chosen by election. That is, just as you can vote for the mayor, the president, or senators, you can also vote for the state attorney general or even the county sheriff. That explains why sheriffs like this have become so famous all over the country.
I'm an equal opportunity law enforcement guy. I lock everybody up. Sheriff Joe Arpaio.
All of this explains why in recent decades, the United States has tightened its laws far more than any other country. For example, in Spain, if you are caught with a small amount of marijuana, something that is only for personal use, it may not even be considered a crime. However, if the Kansas police catch you with a little marijuana, you can get up to 6 months in jail. Given that example, it's not so difficult to imagine why, right now, there are more than 2.2 million Americans in jail. That's right, 2.2 million. To put this in perspective, the problem of prisons in the US is so extreme that it's starting to create a hole in public accounts. Every year, up to $80 billion alone is spent on maintaining their prisons. That's why one of the few things Democrats and Republicans agree on is precisely this problem.
Congress's First Step Act reflects a new criminal justice consensus, but will it reduce mass incarceration?
In other words, it seems very clear that the United States has a problem with crime, and that the formulas they've been cooking up in recent years don't seem to be working. Of course, all of this still does not justify the looting and violence of some radical and violent groups, but it's important for Congress to start taking matters into their own hands. In fact, while we were preparing this video, there was already a congressman who made such a proposal. We're talking about Justin Amash, who until last year belonged to the Republican Party and has now joined the Libertarian Party. Look at this.
This week, I am introducing the Ending Qualified Immunity Act, to eliminate qualified immunity and restore Americans' ability to obtain relief when police officers violate their constitutionally secured rights. Justin Amash on Twitter.
So now the question is over to you. What kind of policies do you think can help integrate the African American population? How can you combat crime and, at the same time, police brutality? You can leave me your answer in the comments. As always, don't forget that we upload new videos every week, so subscribe to VisualPolitik to make sure that you don't miss any of our updates. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.